He's back online. And we've been talking about page 3 of 5D, and you were suggesting, Dr. Kelly, to put the language. Have we finished with that, or do you want to discuss it?
We
Yes.
have some public testimony.
Yeah.
I think we were going to have the public
Yeah.
testimony.
Yeah.
Yes, Ray, you're welcome. This is, I've been advised that we're allowed to give 3-minute break for public testimony for individual each. But we won't have an alarm that goes off like the assembly.
Okay, thank you for making it possible to address you. First of all, on the matter of what was the intent of the original board, why did they leave out this subject that you're bringing up back when the code was revised? Remember that you do have testimony from the former chairman of the board, Rick Benjamin, at that time. And he is in favor of changing the ordinance, and he has said that he was sorry that it was left out when they were revising the ordinance at the time. So he was there. He was chairman of this very body.
I do have that. I have not shared it with everybody else without discussing it with council, but I do have what you introduced to the assembly meeting on his behalf.
Yeah, and I think we should share. I had forgotten about that was at the last assembly meeting.
Well, I can email it to you if you want, if you can print it.
And I think I've now sat through probably 6 hours of your deliberations, and I thank you for your service and working through all of the details here, and I think you're trying to do the right thing. However, there are issues that really need to be decided in the open, and the very basics of this election move. I think it was very unfortunate and inappropriate in the one opinion that you made by saying that the assembly members can remedy ethics problems with moving the election by not making it effective for the 2 or 3 years. Because you've taken away from the assembly the ability in an open public session to weigh things like saving 80,000 unnecessary trips by Anchorage voters. You've got to go through 2 complete elections for assembly members in order for them to move this date and not have any assembly. That's why it took 3 years back in '88 when they passed it. It didn't take effect until 93, I believe, was the first election. You've got to sit through all of the assembly members going through an election. And what that means is you're requiring the citizens of Anchorage to make 80,000 trips to the polls, which would not be necessary if you had an immediate move. And then on top of that, you're suppressing each year probably 50,000 or 60,000 votes that people would not make because of them having to make an additional trip to the polls. And this is huge. And the fact that an assembly member is going to get a term extension of 6 months, 7 months is nothing compared to the convenience of the public doubling, maybe tripling the electorate that elects our members. And this is not a public meeting. It is a public meeting here, but there's only one member of the public here, compared to having this discussion at an assembly meeting with 3 or 4 reporters present, people watching on the TV, and even though all of the assembly members are conflicted with this, you're going to have half of them very much opposed to it, and we'll be discussing it. Now, when you sit here as an ethics board and say, this is unethical, you're tremendously chilling the possible debate out in public that those that benefit from suppressed turnout and low turnout elections, they don't have to debate the merits of saving 80,000 unnecessary trips to the polls. All they have to do is say the ethics board said this is unethical. Chris Birch is unethical. Amy Dombosky is unethical. and you're tremendously chilling the discussion that's possible. And I would ask you please to consider this very carefully, that I've told the Assembly, the matter of ethics, an ethics review is extremely important in public contracting. I've been president of the Chugach Electric Board, and I know how important it is for ethics in public contracting. But I think you're really undercutting yourselves and the purpose of an ethics board if you try to interpose yourself on something that the Assembly has got to make these decisions and weigh these things. Chris Birch has said he will resign in April. He said he would not take his salary. Several others have said they will not take their salary. And do you really want to do you think it's appropriate for the ethics board to be deeply into weighing, the public benefit against these kinds of remedies that the Assembly needs to come up with, in my opinion, in front of the TV cameras with the reporters there and the public in attendance? So thank you for hearing what I have to say, and I hope you will please take this into account and have some discussion of 100,000 suppressed votes and 80,000 unnecessary trips to the polls, that kind of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, can we just quickly get your name?
Ray Craig, K-R.
I just want to make sure we have it because this is recorded, just make sure we have it for the
Yes.
record. Thank you.
So everybody want to take a couple minutes and read this? This was what was read in this letter by Richard Benjamin. And he is a former either member or chair of this board, and was there when they drafted the ethics code. Yeah, he was chair. Thank you for printing that off, Lisa.
So thinking through the language of D, I'm still in favor of having the board weigh in at some point when the Assembly faces a common conflict of interest. And so, one, what's the feeling of the rest of the board on that idea? And then two, more specifically then, the question would be, should the board weigh in sort of before the Assembly has done so or after the Assembly has done so? So it should be sort of like a review of the Assembly's analysis of its potential conflict, how to manage if conflict, if it's substantial, or should it come before? Should the Assembly be required to come to the board before it makes its own analysis?
And Terry, I would go, if you notice the last part of D is what we normally have in the last of full paragraph, what we already have in the code. The board does not have jurisdiction to reweigh the factors considered by an elected body. Would it be, are you suggesting that they do have jurisdiction to reweigh, or simply that they have a say in the management of the conflict.
Well, that, you know, that's why I was thinking about it in terms of not second guessing the assembly, but having the assembly come to us first to get our view out on the table. At the end of the day, we don't have the jurisdiction to second guess their view. That's the way I read this language. So, and that's why I'm saying the advisory opinion that we would produce would not be binding on the assembly. The assembly has the right and authority to do its own evaluation at the end of the day. But at least this would provide a moment in which you would have, but presumably an impartial board of ethics weigh in on the matter.
But with an inability to do number 6, so.
With what?
I
Number
just,
6.
I continue to think that the board doesn't have the ability to weigh in on the totality of the circumstances, so that's uniquely an assembly function.
Do you think 6 is different from the other factors?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
What if we remove 6? Okay. I got you. Yeah. Go ahead, Julia.
I'm just thinking that, that both, I guess, I'm thinking that I agree with that 6 is a different factor. And I also think that 6 is an excellent standard for the board to use when that conflict analogous to the marriage situation comes to the board. And it's not a very good standard for the assembly to use when they're making their disclosure. It's self-serving and an assembly member is put in a spot of saying whether they think in the totality of circumstances. And we really worked hard on this code to make sure that the only one that the assembly did that on was when they thought that the public interest. It was in the request to ask to be excused. And so this one, instead of making a case to be excused, it's put in there to make a case to not be excused, and that really goes against everything that went into the drafting. But as a standard for the board to use when they're if and when they're faced with a conflict on sponsorship or when all assembly members share, or a majority of assembly members share the same interest, or even as Linda was really talking about, when instead of the assembly exercising a duty under the ethics code, it's exercising a duty that it has external, constitutional and charter duty, like certification of elections. You don't even have to get to moving the election date. Assembly members have to certify, oftentimes their own election, have to certify the mayor's election, and it's gone through an election board, but still they have to do that. That somehow, when those kind of conflicts, if and when they come to the board, you have a process. And this is the standard, it seems to me, that the board, that you're talking about the board applying in response to when Dee said before that, well, how does the board do that? What standard do you have? This is sort of the standard, but maybe you have some other ideas that drop in under that help you make that decision.
Because it was kind of like, this is almost the decision that we made 6, although it wasn't there, it was pretty much the decision we made with respect to Assemblyman Trainee's request for advisory opinion, where he had a conflict, and he opted out of it, but at the same time, it was whether the totality of public benefit exceeded his personal or private interest on that particular one. I have no idea whether that particular code, if that passed or not, but he asked us before we could submit it what we thought.
But that one, we ruled that he didn't have a substantial conflict, that him being a veteran was a broad enough class of the
Right.
public that it wasn't a unique enough interest to him.
But at the same time, the public benefit could have exceeded his financial or private interest.
Well, yeah, if we had something like 6, that's something we would have considered as well. But again, I guess that. So Julian, feel free to comment. I mean, that's my worry about 6. I mean, like, what assembly ordinance isn't going to be the kind of thing in which someone claims that the public interest outweighs the financial or private interest? So what if you have an ordinance in which Dick Cheney named himself as receiving various tax benefits, but the ordinance included other elements, revisions to the tax code. And he says, oh, the public benefit, sure, I'll gain several thousand extra dollars a year, but look at what it'll do for the public. We'll save 80,000 trips in this and that. And so I stand to gain massively. But the public stand, I mean, if you think like, this is the argument that happens at a lot of state level, not necessarily our state, but a lot of state and federal level, you know, I don't want to say corruption, but I will. Corruption, it takes place like this, or like he's like, well, of course it's a massive kickback for me, but look what it really did for the public. You know, we got this huge dam built, and that really helped. You know, from the ethics perspective, it seems to me the standard's too broad. But what's your sense about that?
Well, my sense is that yes, that you start with that standard and you match it up with the mitigation. So to use the example, even though you didn't have this, that Keith is looking about with Dick Cheney, is that in Dick's request, right in his request, he offered to never, you know, he said he didn't have any interest in doing this himself. You know, he did some other things like that in there, and so you could match it up with some of the mitigation that Ray talked about. Also on the Chris Birch, he said Chris offered to step down, you know, and not run. I mean, so that it would affect, as somebody who's being turned out, it extended his term, but because he is turned out, in a way he's unique in being able to say he doesn't have an interest if these other mitigation things go into place. The assembly's allowed to appoint to fill a vacancy, you know, for that period. I mean, there are mitigation things, so it seems to me that if you go with this as a standard, it shouldn't be here for the assembly to determine. But it could couple with, again, with that certain set of circumstances that would come to the board, that where you have too many assembly members sharing something, or these unique things where they're trying to implement setting terms, setting elections, setting all these different things, but of course it's going to have to do them. So then you figure out if there are ways to mitigate that, so that the totality of the circumstances, including that mitigation, allows that to go forward.
I wonder, I mean, so what would be the kind of examples of where 6 would apply, where you couldn't instead use more restrictive language, like instead of thinking about it in terms of public benefit exceeding private financial interest, talk about it in terms of charter duties or essential functions or compelling interest or something like that. I mean, like, yeah, the assembly has to certify the election, and there's potentially all sorts of conflicts there. You can't just not certify the election. You can't have city government unless the elections get certified. That might be true for redistricting too. I don't know. I mean, in other words, you know,
Right,
what
I like
kind of-
substituting things like that for public benefit. If you're saying,
Okay.
is public benefit too broad, I think yes,
Okay.
because but I think that that type of standard, but it does need some work on public benefit. Public benefit is gonna be interpreted as outside these duties that are public duties in that sense.
Right.
So, could be public duty.
Right.
Mhm.
Public duty exceeds the financial private interest, and then you have something like that. Yeah, I was reading public benefit to be more narrow, but if from a layman's point of view, yeah, I think absolutely right, that you could have, now I understand what you're saying, that somebody could say, well, the public
Mhm.
benefit is X, Y, and Z get to benefit, and I'm just collateral here.
Yeah, it certainly was easy to exceed that at that point. It's easy to put forth the argument that whatever I'm doing is to benefit a broader group of people.
Well, I think
And
that's
it
I mean, and
exceeds
again,
my
the
private
thing-
interest.
Mhm.
Well, of course it should. I imagine it would most of the time.
Well, that's right, and that's why it would seem like certifying the election is qualitatively different than moving the election date. It's certainly more convenient for Anchorage citizens to be saved an extra drive to the polls.
Right.
I don't think the Assembly has a duty to do that.
Right.
If it had a duty to do that, people could vote from home or
Right.
online or something like that, right?
That's actually
Yeah.
It would be-
in the works.
Well, think of it this way,
According
it would
to
be
the-
required, right? If it had a duty, it would be required to do that, right? You have a duty. Whereas the certification, you can't have a city government unless elections are getting served. So it seems to me like there are some qualitative ways that you could think about. Here are a number of things that the government can't get done unless these particular tasks are performed.
Well, I mean, you're just totally narrowing it at this point. The duties are already in the charter theoretically,
Yeah.
so you're just you're zipping right in there, and no other thing can come before the assembly that has any. So you're making a huge step there.
Can I make a couple of comments?
Yes,
First
and
of
then
all,
Julia, after you.
okay. First of all, I think as I flip back to the full code of 115.035, it applies to all elected officials, and so as I flip back and forth, I just want to make sure that whatever is changed doesn't change the intent of
And
that
that's a
whole
good point.
section.
Right.
That's a good point.
Because a lot of the changes seem to be focused on the assembly at the exclusion of all the other people that are affected by that part.
It's a trickle-down effect, right?
Yeah, it's just a little bit. It's just confusing, and I don't know if that means
That's a good
that
point.
we ought to separate out the assembly part, but anyway, just a little confusing as I flip back and forth. And then the other one, I keep going back to the state, to the statute, and are there other boroughs or municipalities that have dealt with this issue? Do you know?
I'm sure that
Or-
I'm not aware of the details of that.
Or can we potentially look at that part of their own code to see if and how they address it? To me, I like working off of benchmarking best practices, and we have no clue what anyone else is doing, but they all have to do at least this. So my question would be, are any of the other larger boroughs or municipalities doing anything similar that we could at least look at? So, but maybe we don't have time to do that. We probably don't, but maybe in hindsight we ought to do that. So, yeah.
Julia.
I can address a couple of quick comments. When the Assembly passed the ethics code, and in the year of deliberation that they had leading up to passage of that and the incremental changes that went through, the code section that you're talking about, which actually in state law allows the Assembly to recognize and allow people to vote even though they have a substantial financial interest, was explained in detail to this Assembly, although it had different people on it. And the Anchorage Assembly chose not to exercise that full authority. And so there may be a change of sentiment on the part of the Assembly now. And other jurisdictions are mixed on that. So that's there for the fallback that allows some smaller jurisdictions. They're just things that they can't do. It's just too. It mostly comes up in situations where contracts need to be approved and different interdealing with the Assembly and not having a conflict. So that and the Anchorage Assembly chose not to go there.
But you don't. Can you give some reasons why?
They said that they didn't think that they needed to have, Anna Fairclough was chair, and their position basically was that they didn't think it was necessary. They looked at, they went as far as looking at whether they should go through the code and pick out circumstances where they needed super majority vote on the one hand, if there were anything in there where they needed to say that less than a quorum could vote, sort of the opposite of the supermajority vote in case they had this conflict, and ultimately they decided they just thought that the things that were put in place to manage potential conflict, including the role of the ethics board, would be good. They also said that if things didn't work out, they could do amendments, but this time around is the first time that.
So let me ask this then, what was in place prior to this most recent change?
The
were
most
they allowed
recent
to
change
do
was
it?
2007.
Right.
No, they weren't allowed to
Okay.
do that, and there was something that was, in my view, actually pernicious at the time, and that was that the assembly would decide itself without the standards that are in there, whether there was a substantial interest. And then the code very specifically said that the assembly's determination of whether or not there was a substantial conflict was not binding on the ethics board in the event of a violation,
Notice
a
that.
complaint, it was called, of violation. So that what happened was, and it happened to Mr. Coffey, under the old code, they make the disclosure, the assembly says, no, there's no conflict, goes to the ethics board, and the ethics board says, gotcha, that was a conflict. Then there's a whole thing about that. So that's why there's that language in there that says that you don't,
We don't have the jurisdiction
you
to
don't,
reweigh
yeah,
there.
it has to do, it goes to whether there was a full disclosure. If there wasn't a full disclosure, but and the rationale that I brought to the assembly, because I was very new then, that I brought to the assembly was this state code. And I said, you can even allow yourselves, if there is a substantial conflict, so why should you delegate that to a board and be caught in this catch-22 where you can think in good faith that you've done fine, and the ethicists on the board can say, oh no, I'm not looking at any ethics opinions for the state, or I'm not looking at any state statute. That's what Richard Benjamin, told us. He said, we just decide ourselves if there's an ethics conflict.
So when you mentioned that to the assembly, what?
They bought off on that their rule should be, under this code, should be the final, that they were the governing body, but they didn't want to have it, they chose not to. And I had language drafted that they didn't accept.
So is the
So they could have full-on
Right.
exempted themselves from the
Yeah,
call.
right.
and it's,
Yeah,
but they
they
chose
could
some
have,
sort
they
of-
could have said,
Yeah.
they never talked about whether they wanted to exempt themselves from the ethics code, because there was giant pressure on the assembly by the ethics board to produce a code that worked better than the last one. And so they weren't gonna exempt themselves, but they could have under that, given some circumstances, and that's what we talked about with them, some circumstances where it was already set out in code that, or a mechanism that would be set out in code by vote or otherwise, that they could, on a case-by-case basis, say, okay, we recognize that there's a substantial interest, but we're gonna allow you to vote anyway, because we need 6 vote, we need people, we don't, and they, when they boiled it down, they thought, well, that the factors should lead in that direction. And
so, and the assembly can change the code.
Right.
right, and it was always built
Okay.
in that they knew that they might not have it perfect.
So,
I was just giving background on it.
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
they know
yeah,
that-
that's very, very
yeah,
good
it's very,
talking
very
about.
I'm
helpful.
not trying to shut the avenue down. I'm
No.
the advocate of
Yeah,
that.
no,
Yeah.
I-
The whole
I-
approach.
that's really helpful, because I would say that what they're, to me, what they're attempting to do is bring it more in line with the statute by the recommendations that they're making, and ultimately, we can. Here's my view: is that's what I would advise, is that if they are looking for a way to eliminate this type of a conflict when they're all conflicted, that they should look at the statute and rewrite the code to be more in line with the statute that would allow them in instances to do that. I don't think we need to write it for them. I think we could advise them on some pitfalls that they should look out for. But ultimately, they can rewrite the code, and they could rewrite it this way, like they didn't want to do before. But they could basically give themselves complete exemption if they so choose.
Well, they can,
So-
but should, I mean, I take it they're being asked
Yeah.
for advice from us, like,
Right.
should, and that just seems too, I mean, given the purpose of the
Yeah.
code, and again, you think it's, the language is idealistic, but it's there, I mean, you just can't
Yeah.
throw language like securing the public trust and the integrity of
Yeah.
governmental decision making. You just can't throw language in the law like that and then say, oh, well, morality doesn't, or those principles don't count. It's there, it's in the law. The
For a
purpose
matter
of-
of convenience.
The
Right.
purpose of the
Yeah.
code is to promote those
Yeah.
ideals, and then the question, you're not plucking it out of thin air. It's like, what good conflict of interest provisions look like if the public trust and public respect in the process is what the code's supposed to be providing. And I would suggest, just sort of exempting, governmental bodies in general. I think that the state code is too lax, and just like exempting them altogether from
Right.
conflict of interest provisions. I don't think it's a good idea. One, given the ideals that this code is trying to promote, I don't think that's particularly consistent.
Well, especially like Julia said, maybe that, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, you had your hand up? or
Yeah.
I'm sorry, dude.
No, go.
You know, I cannot, in good conscience, support this that exempts assembly members from a conflict. Well, I can't support that. However, on a case-by-case basis, when you look at this, I can support something to the effect, if it says, if you wanted to put together something that said, governing bodies be allowed to set election dates. That rather than to pull them completely out of that conflict law. Just put, they can't do this under the conflict law, except you could put one exception to determine election dates. And then nobody has a problem with it. And they can say, well, you think that'll give us a conflict? And you can say, we can rule and say, no,
Well-
we don't feel it's gonna be that much of a conflict because it benefits the public and stuff like that.
Dave, then Julia?
Well, I was just gonna say that it was kind of following up on a comment from Terry. That in the event the state had that provision in there for certain circumstances that the municipality was trying to avoid. Meaning, the reasons to have that, if I understand what Julie was saying earlier, is that sometimes you need to have certain exceptions where you're in small communities and you have one governing board. They have to make lots of decisions. That makes sense, and that as a baseline type of ethical determination in the state statute doesn't necessarily mean that Anchorage falls into those. The reasoning behind the state or the city making its choice, it sounds deliberate. That maybe this assembly has changed its mind from previous assemblies, but the assembly acted deliberately in excluding that. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't
Oh, right.
And it may have applied to reasons that don't apply to the municipality, or that was the reasoning behind it. That was my only comment.
Yeah.
If I understood what Julie was saying.
But ultimately, they also have the right and the ability to change it back.
Absolutely.
Yes, Julia.
Right, so, first I'm gonna say what I had originally raised my hand for before, but I ended up using some time to do this, and that was when we were back talking about public benefit and public duty, I think that whatever words end up being in the initial standard, that the board wants to take into consideration that the assembly is exercising a duty when it sets an election date. It's in the exercise of its duty. So when I talk about the public duty, I'm not limiting it the way that Terry was, and the way that, and I agree with Dee, that if we're gonna go with that's so restrictive. And so I think that, and I think this goes into what Ted was saying, because you could have an election date, you could have changing the terms of the assembly as an exercise of a duty. There's some prescribed duties that the assembly, at the time that they looked at the state code, weren't pressing on them. so they didn't have in mind. And that the state code, to my knowledge, has never been used as a blanket to exempt
Right.
any public body from having an ethics code, because you have to have those other things in place anyway.
Right.
So, but what it does is it allows jurisdictions like Anchorage to create some field of exemptions where it comes up. And in our case, in the case of Anchorage now, unlike the time when we looked at it, and unlike the smaller communities, the Anchorage doesn't have a problem so much about contracts, but as your initial ethics opinion has brought to light, we do have a problem when it has to do with some of these duties that, as Linda pointed out, are sort of charter and constitutional exercise of powers of the assembly, and that they're, should be linked up so that the tail isn't wagging the dog under some kind of umbrella that allows both the public discourse and some mechanism to rule on it on a case-by-case basis. And so that's what I'm drawing from all your pieces.
So it's now 20 after 1, and if we don't start working towards some sort of resolution or recommendation now, we're not going to get done by 2 o'clock, and we don't have a whole lot of time between now. Yes.
If I could ask Julie, isn't there a way that they could do that without exempting themselves completely out of the conflict of interest?
Yes, and I think that this goes back to what, and I'm sorry,
Steve.
What
Yeah.
Steve was saying. I don't think that you have to write it for the assembly.
Yeah.
I think that you want to come up with something that pulls together these different kind of bullet points that here's our general comments. Our general comment is to proceed with it this way. The wording here, the exception swallows the whole, and instead we think that you should rely on. I'm just saying what I'm hearing you saying. I'm not trying to
Yeah,
add.
no,
so you have
no,
to
that's
correct me,
exactly
but,
right.
but then it would go something like this:
Yeah.
that we draw the Assembly's attention to the state code, which allows the Assembly to devise certain circumstances in which conflict of even a substantial conflict of interest does not preclude
Yeah.
participation. We suggest that the Assembly's exercise of constitutional and charter duties and powers is an example, and that in the case of conflict, it should be. We would like to see it developed in a public discussion, and then perhaps the Assembly consider, analogous to the mayor's situation where there's no peer to go to, that the Assembly send it to the ethics board, and the ethics board will use this standard, or a standard standard approved by the Assembly, does the totality of the circumstances, and we'll send it back to you as an advisory opinion.
Okay, that's on a specific topic, rather than removing them from all conflict of interest.
Right.
Yeah,
Right,
okay.
right, and then just let them say, okay, we're gonna have somebody draft this, and then,
So,
I'm not sure, you have to.
No, well, she wasn't looking at me, she was looking at you, so.
oh, Julie, if I'm hearing you correctly, then it sounds like for something like the election change of date example, that the Assembly might then give that to the board with certain facts. So for example,
Right.
Greg, as Mr.
Craig.
Craig, he was saying, he spouted off several facts upon which he relied for his argument. And so the Assembly could make findings of fact if they agreed with those facts. I'm not saying they do or don't, but that way, because otherwise, there are assumptions and not facts that the whole Assembly has voted on for this board to consider. I mean, do you see where I'm going with that? It seems like if the Assembly wants the board to weigh in, the Assembly ought to lay out the facts. as the assembly finds.
Right,
the
and what
facts.
if they do that in the context of a request for
That-
Exactly.
I think that would be
advisory
Dee's
opinion,
model,
and
that-
then.
Right.
And then,
That's right.
and then they could also just have the record of their discussion go in. I mean, you know, I think that all those are good questions. I'm not gonna have an answer to them right off the top of my head, and I don't think you should spend your afternoon
Yeah.
figuring that out either, but you should highlight those so that then the assembly can go and figure something out that's different. And I think you do, it seems like sponsorship is a little glitch there. It needs to be figured out in a way that doesn't swallow the whole. And that the totality of the circumstances should be a standard exercise for when you're gonna have the exception that says, that even a substantial financial or private interest isn't gonna interfere, but it should be part of a standard over there, instead of something that the assembly has to say every time. And I think the total benefit is bigger than me. I mean, I just, that's
All right,
bad,
Steve.
not so good.
Thank you, Julia.
Well, I don't know how you want to approach this, but here, I'll give you.
I'm trying to figure that out
Yeah, I'll
myself.
give, so here's my view, and I agree, I don't think we should rewrite it, I don't think we should write it. I think, and I think the one issue is, it's obvious that what's being asked for is some amount of exclusion under the substantial financial interest area for the assembly members. And the statute allows it exclusively. I think our code over the course of time has been restrictive of that, and I don't think that should be ignored. And I would just ask that, you know, I mean, they can just rewrite the code and address, here's my position, that they should rewrite the code to address the exclusion with the understanding that the board doesn't, that we don't feel that it's exclusive. So they ought to stipulate when they can participate and still have a substantial financial interest. And I don't think that's clearly laid out in what they presented.
And
So-
maybe with a couple of citations such as elections, redistricting.
Well, however they want to do it, but I think that I think that what's expected from us, I think we all agree that there should be some restrictions on that exclusion. We should, and they need to tell us what they want that to be. We shouldn't tell them, I don't think, because quite frankly, I don't know if I could come up with a list of things, to be honest with you. I don't know their business as well as they know their business. So,
Yes.
So I wonder, so maybe three recommendations come to mind. One, it seems like that there's consensus on the board that the current language is too broad, and that it winds up falling into the model where it just
The
simply
current
presents
code or the current
the current
amendment?
language of the ordinance, the proposed.
The proposed.
proposed.
The
Yeah.
proposed
Yes,
one.
that it's too broad, and we could articulate in a memo some of the reasons why we think it's too broad. But that secondly, and then there's two in principle things. It sounds like there's also consensus that one, we do accept the idea that there should be some sort of public duty factor added to the conflict of interest analysis to offer wiggle room in the kind of cases where the assembly has a fundamental duty like certifying an election, yet they all may be conflicted in exactly the same way, and that there should be, and that currently the code doesn't really actually provide the wiggle room that the assembly needs to do its job. But that three, it also sounds like that we all agree that in the process of deciding how to apply and weigh those particular factors, there ought to be some moment in the process in which this board is offered an opportunity to advise the assembly and offer some advisory opinion, weighing those factors and offering advice to the assembly on whether the conflict is substantial, given that we've added a public duty standard as well. But there ought to be some moment for this board to offer some official input and advice on that decision. Am I right in thinking that we all agree to those three? I mean, I'm pretty sure we agree with the first two. The third one?
Yeah,
I agree.
I think so.
I agree with what Terry just said. Which is a little bit of what Julia was saying. I know that wasn't Julia's position. I understand what she was trying to echo, what she was hearing from us. And I
And I was
agree.
trying to echo what I heard from her.
And we're all trying to echo.
Echo is very
echo.
very heavy reverb.
Echo,
It's-
echo.
No,
It sounds like a surf band.
Yes.
I agree
Yes.
with that. I
Okay,
agree with
and what I'm hearing you say.
And you wanna next?
Correct me if I'm
Are you
wrong.
going to echo what I was?
No, I know, I want to try to say what you're saying and make sure I've got this right. That if we included something in there that give them the elected body or the assembly, if you want to spell it out or whatever, that when they come into a situation where they're all have a conflict of interest or whatever, they present all the stuff to the ethics board. The ethics board can review it and say, no, you know, this outweighs the conflict, so go forward with it.
That's right, and we would leave it, you know, and we could, you know, spell this out in a memo, but that the code would remain the same, and that
Right.
final authority ultimately rests with them.
Yeah,
I mean,
leave the
we
code
can't-
the way it is.
Certainly, the board
Yeah.
cannot usurp their authority to make the final decision, but I do think it's important that this board, as particularly in that kind of circumstance where they all might be conflicted, that this board offer a kind of impartial perspective from some people who know the code very well and are thinking very carefully about these issues, and that the process include that moment where we can advise the assembly in a way that's public, in a way that can enhance the public debate, and get that out there. There's probably, you know, with the exception of Dee and Julia, but there's no one in this city who thinks as much as this code as we do, and so in some sense we're in a very unique position to offer our insight into you know, a particular situation and whether there's a significant conflict or not.
And that would be on a case-by-case basis.
Case, we would keep it as a case-by-case
Well,
basis.
yeah.
And that way,
Yeah.
because I'm not so, as a member of the Board of Ethics, I'm in terms of this particular, I'm a lot less worried about, oh, when should the election date be and this and that. I mean,
Yeah.
I can see that there's many, you know, potentially many cases like certifying an election. That's the kind of case I'm like, oh, yeah, right. You know, like if they certify an election and they, you know, are they all conflicted? Could someone file a notice of potential violation? You know, and it's like, okay, yeah, there are things that the assembly is going to, you know, depending on your view, do fairly commonly, or in my view, fairly rarely, but it will happen that the assembly is going to have to do things in which they all might be conflicted. And there ought to be some way in which the code handles that, provides a little bit of wiggle room in those kinds of cases.
I'm ready to go forward with it.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, no.
You didn't have anything, you sounded, you acted like you wanted to say something.
No, I think the board is moving forward toward a general position. So now it's how to get that to paper.
One last.
What?
Oh,
No,
sorry,
you go.
I was going to say, one, in terms of detail, what do people think about
Yeah.
6, you know, in terms of thinking through? So we've got, and Julia's, I think, articulated it really well. There's two, at least two ways of thinking about it. The way I've been tending to think about it is that the kind of cases where we would say, oh, if you looked at 1 through 5, this is a clear conflict of interest. But given this public duty exception, we can see that it needs to get done. Is that the kind of thing where you're thinking, like I am, this is a compelling state interest, the state must be doing this kind of stuff? Like, so to me, the model, the ideal example is certifying an election. The election has to get certified for city government to keep moving forward. A budget must get passed for a city government to keep moving forward. So that would mean it's fairly rare, to be honest, that this kind of, you know, that this would get implemented. Or the way I read 6 as it's currently written, it's fairly broad, right? You know, that you would be able to say, well, we're all conflicted, and it's not compelling, we don't have to do it, and here moving the election would be the example. The Assembly absolutely does not have to move the election from April to November. There's no argument that it's a compelling interest that the state do so. It's maybe more convenient. There's all sorts of interesting policy reasons why you might want to do so, but I don't see it as a duty. 6, the way it's written, would include something like that. It would say, hey, there's a lot of public benefit to it, and those kind of arguments would come to count. So in other words, so one way of reading 6 would be fairly broad, in which you could just simply say that there's a lot of public benefit to this, and it outweighs the immediate conflict of interest. The other way of looking at it is much more restrictive, saying when you're all conflicted, this had better be really important, like essentially important. Otherwise, we're not going to buy it. So what's the view of the board? What's the feeling that people have, you know? Because as we write it, we should, if we can come to a consensus, we should offer at least some indication that's sort of how we're thinking.
Well,
about it.
if you insist that all the facts will be presented and it's on a case-by-case basis, you know, then it leaves it up to the board to make the recommendation to that.
That's true, but we should try to make it clear to the assembly what we think the standard, because the language might change of 6-2. I mean, you know, do we think, is the standard, it's sort of like, is the standard of importance essential, or is it like good idea?
Well, it could be both. You know.
I think one of the things I got from what Julia said, which was important to me, is that that number 6 probably should not be a general part of the equation, except in unique situations. That we don't want that for your run-of-the-mill, my husband is a fire person. But that's only in the case of unique situations. This might be an additional standard the Assembly considers. And I think that's a very valid point, because you can only imagine the amount of time the Assembly will be bogged down in this public benefits analysis. So number
or just think about our
one,
recent Lursa case, right?
Yeah.
Surely that argument would have been made, like,
Yeah.
hey, no one else would be willing to
so
serve
number
if
one
I
is
did those.
that number 6 does not become one of the general factors. That's
Unless.
segregated over to when you have a unique or
Yeah.
this other type of situation. I myself I'm against the compelling nature. I think it's like once it becomes a case by case, the board should not be making a standard of whether it's compelling.
Yes,
I think that the way 6 is written is good, just the way it is.
I think number 6 really ties into the one part of the statute that's missing in the code, which is exempting the governing body from the substantial financial interest. That's really the two connect. Okay, what we're saying is, or I think what they're asking for is number 4, under special circumstances, which is really what 6 is in the proposal. So maybe it's as simple as adding. Well, they've added a 7 to subparagraph C, but maybe adding an 8 to subparagraph C that addresses the paragraph 4 in the statute, with the stipulation that under these special circumstances, such as the public benefit exceeds the financial or private interest, and then leave D. Don't change anything in D.
Well, that is exactly what 6 says.
Well, but what I'm saying is move it to
Move it. I
move
see
it
what
move
you
it
mean.
to
Yes.
the place
Yeah. Okay.
where the other parts of the statute are in our code,
Yeah.
which is in that list in C.
yes, Steve.
I'm concerned that we are wordsmithing at this point, and that I think
As
that the
opposed to
board
providing-
has mostly reached some conceptual conclusions, with the one exception of the standard for public benefit. And I think Ted and I spoke in favor of the similar language to now. And again, it's only to the unique situation of conflict.
Just
And
move that 6 in there.
I think, Terry, you're going the other way on that, and we haven't heard from the other 3 members of the board. And just in concept, that one exception when you have the common conflict.
No, I think I'm in agreement with you, Dee. What I'm trying to say though, to me, it helps align with the statute, and whether we have to do that or not, I guess, is another question. But I think that we want the exceptions in special circumstances. So I think I'm in agreement
Okay.
with you.
Yes, Dave.
I was just going to add that I agree with the concept of having this one standard apply when this relatively unique situation comes up, because I don't think it's going to be very often. I don't think it's when the assembly is all conflicted and they seek an opinion from, if this were to happen, and if they were to then go to the ethics board for an opinion, that's a pretty rare circumstance, I think. And then it would fit to then include this particular in that
Well,
deliberation.
but
Yes.
there could be an instance when it would only affect one assembly member. If it was something that needed to happen in Eagle River, and the only person that would benefit from it would be in Eagle River, then that person could bring it to us, and we could really, it would benefit, even though you're gonna benefit from it a little bit,
But wouldn't that-
it would help the public much more than that, so we could rule on that.
That would be under the
Yeah.
current disclosure
Yeah.
rules,
Yeah,
and the
but
chair
then
would
just-
allow them.
Yeah, that's all in front of the
Unless-
assembly.
covered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
we
just-
need to comment on that.
I'm just wondering that Julia might be able to help us with something. I think the language of this, and maybe this is too much into wordsmithing, is when let's see, when a financial or private interest is held in common by members of the assembly. That's sort of, I think everybody here is assuming that's everybody, whereas it can come up in a quorum situation too. There's not enough to have a quorum to look at the disclosure. Julia, do you think, and maybe that's just that's not our problem, that that's an issue for the assembly rewrite, because it could come up, but then if 6 people have the interest in common and then they don't have a quorum or whatever it takes to not have a quorum. So I don't
What's the quorum for the
I think
assembly?
the
8
assembly
or 7?
wanted specific comment on this. And there's some things in this that don't work at all. And so just in general, my philosophy is that when you're saying, no, this doesn't work, it's good to give an avenue on how it could work. Otherwise, you just look like you're like, no, no, no. And so that was kind of the vein that's the vein that I work in, and that's the vein that I was suggesting that you guys do, is to sort of, and to me, you know, where you have a potential split among your working group here between whether the area that it should be exercised is narrow or left broad. You could say we discuss this and we leave that up to the assembly.
That's
You
right.
don't have to come to consensus on all of that
Right.
stuff. And what's
I
good
agree.
is that you have comment, because that's something that was important to you. You guys, as Terry has said, even more than the assembly, you know this code. And so that's a point for the assembly to then pick up on and say, yeah, this is a way. How broad, how narrow do we want to make it? Do we want to go with something that's a compromise? It's not all total benefit, but it's when we're doing this, or, you know, or whatever. So I would get your consensus points down.
So with respect to drafting this, since you had something.
That's what I was, you and I
I
spoke
was,
at the same time, that's what I was thinking, I don't know. I would propose you.
I was actually, but I was actually going to suggest that Steve and Dr. Kelly work together.
Yeah, they're both at UA.
Well, that's convenient, but we have to be careful not to have more than 2 people.
Why did you, I'm not.
Well,
why
because
recommend both?
I like his ideas about making sure that it's we're consistent with the state.
And consistent with the rest of the code.
Yes. And he kept bringing us back to it, like, keep looking here back, guys. There's a lot
Right.
more stuff than just that one. And then I like where Terry was going with the 3 ideas or whatever we come up with, and then we can.
The only reason I mentioned your name, Terry, is because you had drafted something like this to start off with when you took that trip to Hawaii and left us here.
And
Yeah.
if you could afford,
I will in fact say that I wrote that on my lanai, a laptop on my lap, with a glass of white
Right.
wine, watching whales jump off.
Yes.
in the bay.
Right.
I would avoid
No, but
words
that's the
like,
only reason. If you don't have time for something, I
I would
as you
avoid
know,
words
I'm
like
happy to do
Kafkaesque,
that.
however.
That's
What's that?
That's right.
When does this
yeah.
need to be done?
Kafkaesque. Well, we have to have a meeting.
But now we
We
can
have another
But,
meeting?
but now Steve Jerry's okay, right?
Yes.
No, that phrase.
It's
Well,
the
the
11th.
11th is the hearing date,
Yeah.
but
They read that. This
but
cost-
someone in Birch wanted to have us have a meeting with the committee of the whole of the Elections and Ethics Committee.
We go apart like city.
So that's up to someone in Trombley as to when we would meet then.
So that's before the 11th, so it would have to be done before that meeting. The opinion.
Which is the day before our next meeting.
Well, we don't know yet, because that hasn't been.
No, our
set
next
up.
meeting's on the 12th, though.
Our next meeting, but that would be something completely different. But
Yeah, unless we were meeting before that, then we can make it part of the meeting.
no, but
Oh
I
yeah, why don't we just meet weekly?
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
How about we just meet every night
Yeah.
at 7:00?
I have a conflict next Wednesday.
Why don't you start getting paid for that? Show up. For those of you
The
who
city
got
can't
rid
afford
of
that.
that $50 a meeting is starting to.
We didn't get rid of
Well,
direct your
we're gonna meet
concern
25
to
times a
the
year.
direct your concern to the 8th floor.
I can have something turned around really fast. I mean, so Steve, I can send you a draft like probably tomorrow.
Okay.
I can send
I'll
stuff
hold
out.
him to it because he sometimes drafts stuff on while he's
No, I'll
riding
forget.
his
If he
bike
doesn't
on the
send
way
it to me-
here.
If you don't send it to me, I'll forget. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
it's
all.
on you.
No, that would be very, very.
Now, again, I've had a lot of problems
But can
emailing
you-
things to people,
Yeah.
so it's not to be going
With,
through.
Sullivan Trombley?
I'll try.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how much time we have.
Okay.
7, 8, 9, 10. So we've got a whole week in between. So if you all can come up, well,
No, I
but
know, I'm
that's,
just.
yeah, if you could come up with something this week, and then we hold a meeting with the Assembly Ethics and Election Committee the next week, then that's still
What
prior
day
to
is
the
that?
11th.
That's the 11th we're meeting?
It's the 11th. So we've got a whole, this week and a whole week after that.
I do have a conflict next Wednesday, but,
Meaning the 5th.
yeah.
I am
No,
out
no,
of
no,
town
pardon me,
4th,
that's
5th,
this
6th.
next Wednesday.
Yeah, I can't meet next Wednesday.
Yeah, next week is 4th, 5th, and 6th.
You're out of town.
You're out-
We did this
out
because you
for
were gonna be out of
David,
state.
okay.
Yeah.
What if, so it looks like either at the end of this week or that Monday to meet with the other,
Monday the 3rd.
Yeah.
The 10th
The 10th.
or the
no, it'd be the
Yeah.
3rd.
Huh?
It'd be the 3rd.
The 3rd.
No, don't you meet with, does he need a whole week before, between meetings?
Well, it's just be, or you could do
I don't
the
know.
7th, or it's just that the middle of our week is, we can't.
Well, didn't Trombley want to meet with us?
Yeah, that's,
And what
Is
if
that the
this-
meeting you're trying to set up?
This meeting, what are we setting up now? Meeting?
I just wanted to know when you're available to set up a meeting with the Assembly Ethics and Election Committee to discuss
I could do the
the
3rd.
opinion.
Or I could do the 7th.
I'm flying back on the 7th, so
So
probably
So no on
third-
that.
third.
Or the 10th.
So it's either the 3rd or the 10th, which would be right before, a day before the meeting.
I mean,
I'm
10th
available
would,
3rd or the 10th.
10th would be probably better for me,
Better?
but I
We
know
have a
that's
meeting.
really
That's too
tight.
close.
Well,
Yeah,
It's
maybe
really
it's
too
It's
close,
tight for
isn't it?
any,
So I guess we're kind of stuck on the 3rd. Unless I mean, you're welcome to go without me. I mean, I don't need to be there necessarily. I'm just saying.
my schedule's open.
the 3rd or the end of this week. Thursday or Friday, depending on how quickly
Uh,
the
Yeah.
collaboration can
Friday
happen.
would be better for me than Thursday.
yeah, Thursday you have to work.
We're back to another date now. Sorry.
Well, I'm just want to have a few dates
what
just
were
in
the
case.
other options?
The end of this week, Thursday or Friday, and we were saying no on Thursday, but so maybe at Friday.
Maybe Friday.
The 31st?
Uh-huh.
I could do the 31st, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got Friday or Monday.
Friday or Monday. Does that work for you? I think so.
And then if not, then we should go for the period of time when David's not going
And
to be
then just
here.
do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that probably be the best anyway.
Yeah. I knew that was
Let's get a lot
that
more
was a
done.
door that was just open.
Yeah.
Walk right
I'm
through
never going
it.
to pass up the logo of evolutionary survival strategy.
Yes.
I see. I am concerned that as the attorney for the board that I see this opinion though before it gets distributed to the assembly.
You can send it to her, right?
Oh yeah, no,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
He is having problems with email, though, he said earlier.
Yeah.
With Kit.
He doesn't,
Oh.
he doesn't read his email.
Well,
Yeah.
are we going to see this before?
Well, that's why I'm
we meet?
concerned. So far,
Yeah.
it's just the two of you. These guys
I'd
can
like to
draft
see
it.
this before we
Yeah.
meet.
Yeah, that's what I
before
will. We haven't
ethics.
figured that one out.
So just send it to everybody.
So this,
Yeah.
wow.
We just
next
have to make
Friday
sure,
really-
we just can't vote on,
We can't meet
Comment.
together.
we can't meet together, but we can read it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can read it,
Read
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Well, it's the email traffic back and forth. It could be a serial meeting.
I mean,
Now,
do
what
we
do
really
we
need
do?
to do that? I mean, Steve and I were the only people who had good ideas here today anyway.
Well, if we ignore that comment and then just go, the 31st would make it really tough if we're going to review something. But whatever. I mean, it's
Friday.
I'd like to. When you get a copy, John?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow? You think so?
It
Let's
may
see.
just be a one-page document, guys.
Yeah, I
It's
don't
not gonna be that long.
Yeah, there's a
It should be
good chance.
pretty
I mean, there's a
simple.
good chance, reasonable chance I can write it tonight during Elias's gymnastics class. So, but yeah, I think I don't have class until 1 tomorrow. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
I can. You know.
So we could meet Friday or Monday. Yeah. And if not,
This Friday or Monday?
Yeah.
yeah.
So can we state that in a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Do you need it?
All in favor?
Okay,
I will paraphrase.
any opposed? None opposed?
Move to adjourn.
Wait a minute, we have one other thing. Those other two items were purposely put into this
Yes.
so that we did actually deal with when we're gonna deal with them. So either we're going to put these on the agenda for the next meeting, or we're gonna set a special meeting.
Not a special meeting. I moved that they be put on the 12th.
And then on the
Yeah.
12th, you can decide whether you need a special meeting for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wanna do
Yeah.
that?
Agenda
Special
for the
meetings
12th.
are killing me.
Okay, so let's make a motion to return to the
She's
regular.
just running
agenda.
our meeting for me, thank you.
Meeting schedule.
Second.
Okay,
So we're meeting this Friday?
Or
well, we'll have to
She's
get
gonna
with
help.
Adam and figure out when his committee.
that's with the
Oh, okay,
subcommittee.
okay.
And he wanted to have a committee of the whole, so that's gonna pull together.
Well, that's the thing, I'm sloppy.
Well, that would require notice
It's
and all
much
sorts of
easier
stuff,
for me to
so.
just.
Well, at least 24 hours, right?
And that's where we're at our strength.
But
I'm a terrible editor,
if
but
I
don't
can
mind sitting down and blasting
start that
something out, right?
conversation now on which of these two dates, or if we have to go into 4, 5, 6.
Hey,
What's my opinion here?
the 11th was a compromise between the 28th and
Well, it's
the,
going to be that long. They just need to address these.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to me, all we got to do is address number 4. That's the issue.
so I need one more
They
motion.
don't have
Move to adjourn.
exemptions. That's what
We have a
Thank you,
second?
Ted.
That's the way I look at it.
Okay, meeting's adjourned.